Hey everybody, welcome back to FrontendExpert. In this video, we'll be talking about HTML tables and going over all of the different tags associated with tables. When we talk about tables, we're referring to tabular data, which simply means data with rows and columns. I like to think of this as anything you could put in a spreadsheet, you could also put in a table. However, anything that you could not put in a spreadsheet also probably does not belong in a table. And we want to be very careful about using tables for this correct purpose and not just using them whenever we need a two-column layout, for example. In that case, we would want to use CSS with the correct appropriate HTML tags for our content. And with that in mind, let's go ahead and create our first table. So to create a table, we'll use the table tag, and this tag is a wrapper around the entire table. And inside of this table, we will include all of the rows of the table, which we do with the table row tag, or TR. And then in each row, we need to define whatever data is in that row, whichever cells are part of the row, and we can do that using the TD tag for table data. And for example, let's say this one is $200. And now we can go ahead and save, and we'll have $200 on the screen as our first table data. And we could go ahead and add another piece of table data, and maybe this one is just $100, and we'll save again, and you'll see the second piece of data within the row appears to the right of the first piece of data within that row. However, if we wanted some data to appear in another row below the $200 and $100, we'll add another TR tag for another table row. So we can do that now, TR, and then we'll add some data inside of this row, and maybe this one is going to be $250. And then we'll add another piece of data below it for maybe $300. And I'll go ahead and save. And you can see that new row appears below the first row we had. At the top, we have the first table row, which is $200 and $100. And then we have $200 and $100 at the top of our output. Finally, we have $250 and $300, which corresponds to the last row in our HTML. One thing you might notice here is that we have no headings on the table. Because of this, the data in the cells has no actual meaning. To add table headings, we simply make another table row, except this row will be a row of headings rather than data. So we'll do a table row, and then inside of the row, instead of table data, we'll use the TH tag for table heading. We can say this first column is going to be our budget, and then we can say the second column with another table heading will be our spending. We can go ahead and save, and you can see by default we get this nice bold text that appears at the top of the table because it's the first row, and these have headings of budget and spending, which can correspond to the columns below them. Now, headings don't only work for a column, we also sometimes need a heading for an individual row. If we look at this example, it still doesn't really make sense. We know we budgeted $200, but what did we actually budget that for? So what we can go ahead and do is in our table rows, we can add table headings in line to these individual rows. So here we can say maybe this was our food budget, and then in the bottom table row, we can say this was our entertainment budget. And when we go ahead and save, you can see we get the new headings, but it sort of shifted everything over. And the issue here is that these bottom table rows each have 3 items in them, 3 cells or 3 columns, but the top table row only has 2. So these 2 headings are shifted over farther than we want. To fix this, I'll go ahead and add another table heading here, and this will be the heading for the far left column that says food and entertainment. I'll go ahead and call this category, and when I save, our table should look correct again. But something you might have noticed while looking at this is that we're using some of the same tags for multiple different purposes, and we know that semantically that can be confusing. If we have the same tag used for 2 different things, how would somebody using a screen reader, for example, know what's what? How do they know if this category heading is a heading for the column or for the row? And the short answer is they might not be able to know. So the way we can fix that is using an attribute. And the attribute we can use is called scope. So I'll add scope to this category heading, And what scope says is this heading for a row or a column? And in this case, this is a heading for a column, so we can add scope equals column. And I'll go ahead and do the same thing for the budget and the spending. And then we can come down to our food heading, and we can add another scope here, but this one is a row heading. So we'll do scope equals row, and we'll do the same thing for entertainment. And when I save here, you'll notice nothing really changes in the output. Everything is the exact same. The only difference is just that we have a more semantically appropriate HTML file, and it'll make more sense to people using accessibility tools. Just like we're using table headings for multiple purposes, you might have also noticed we are using table rows for multiple purposes. So at the top here, we have a table row that just contains headings. However, these table rows contain actual data in the table, and we need a way to differentiate these as well. And the way we do this is using semantic grouping tags, but tags that are specific to the table. So at the top of the table, we'll add a t-head, which is very similar to the header tag that we use for a standard semantic grouping tag, but this takes whatever header information the table has, and in this case, it's this top row. And then we also have another tag that we can use called tBody for table body, and this contains the actual main body, the data of the table, and we'll put these two rows inside of there. And now again, this isn't going to change the output, it just makes our HTML a little bit cleaner and more semantically correct. Next up, it would be nice if we had some totals. This way our user could see the total budget or the total spending without having to do that addition themselves. So the way we can go ahead and do that is to add a footer, and the footer will use the tfoot tag. So we can add a tfoot here. And then inside of this, we will add more table rows. So we can add a table row, and this will be the row for this footer. And then within this row, we'll go ahead and add a table heading. And this will be the heading for the total column. So we can call this total. And then we can go ahead and add the actual data. So the first data will be $200 plus $250, which is going to be $450. And then we can add one more table data for 100 and 300, which will be $400. Now, this would usually be better to do with JavaScript rather than hard coding these values into the HTML. However, for now, this is fine just to show what this table footer would look like. And sometimes you have data that actually isn't going to change, in which case it can be fine to just manually do this using HTML. And now one last component to our table that we are missing is we don't have any name or heading for the table. There's no title to this table, if you will. And the way we can fix that is to go all the way back to the top. And at the very beginning of our table, we'll go ahead and add what's called the caption tag. And this is just like it sounds. It's the caption for the table, or sort of like a heading for it. We'll go ahead and just call this our budget. And when we save, you can see we get that budget text at the top, which by default is centered and looks quite nice. But again, we can always change what any of the table looks like using CSS. And with that, we not only have a completed table, but we also have a table that is accessible due to our use of the semantic components. However, I do want to show a few more attributes and a few more tags that we can use for some more specific use cases. So one attribute that we can add to both table headings as well as to our individual pieces of table data is going to be this column span attribute, or col span. And what this says is essentially how many columns is this a heading for? Most of the time we have headings that are just for one column, like this one is. But for example, if we added the value of 2 here, you would see that all of our headings sort of shifted over one column. And the reason for that is because now the category is spanning 2 columns. And you can do the same thing with rows as well to do a row span if you wanted to do that. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and delete this and go back to our properly marked up table. And lastly, there's one more tag I wanted to show, and that's called a column group. So we can go ahead and go up here and create a column group. And what the column group is it allows you to select the columns of the table. And the purpose of this is mostly just for CSS. We don't actually need the column group for the proper semantic markup of our HTML. So the way this is going to work is you add a col column here. And within this column, you need to define a span. And this is how many of the columns you want this to affect. So for example, we can say span equals 2. And then this is a self-closing tag. And you'll see this doesn't actually change the output at all. But what we can do here is add styles or CSS classes to this column that will affect the entire columns that are spanned. So the first 2 columns in this instance. So for example, we could do style equals, we can say background red. And I would usually not recommend using inline styles like this, but just to show what this looks like, when we do style as background red, it will change the first 2 columns because we have span equals 2 to being red. And again, I would not recommend using this inline style syntax. I would recommend instead using a class and doing something like class equals red, and then defining that class in CSS, but I don't have that CSS defined at the moment. So I'll go ahead and delete this column group. And that'll be the end of this video on HTML tables. So to quickly recap, we create a table using the table tag, and then we add at the top of it a caption, which is sort of a name for the table. And then within the table, first we have the table head, which contains the top row of the table with the column headers. And then below that, we'll add the table body, which contains each of the individual table rows with actual data. And then at the bottom, we'll have a table foot if there's any things like total rows or any footer style rows that don't contain actual data, they contain some aggregate of the data. And then with each table heading, for example, this one for the food heading, we'll add a scope attribute to make sure that our semantic markup explains what this is a heading for. Is it a heading for a row or for a column? And with that, that's going to do it for this video on HTML tables. I hope you found it helpful, and I'll see you in the next video.